نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So we're picking up, carrying on from our discussion of the book Talkhis Nukhbatul Fikr, and this book is authored by Sheikh Umar Muqbil Afdallahu Ta'ala, and this book is a Talkhis, it's a summary of the book of Ibn Hajar Rahimahullah Ta'ala that is known as Nukhbatul Fikr. And as we know that this area, this book, it discusses the topic of matters regarding Ulum al-Hadith, so matter relating to Usul al-Hadith, or what is referred to as Ilm al-Mustalah al-Hadith. So discussing the terminologies and the understanding of these terminologies of the ulama of hadith, and also the principles by which they follow. So today we'll be continuing from what we had discussed last week, or continue with a new discussion with author Rahimahullah Ta'ala Ibn Hajar. He mentioned that it is titled, this discussion he mentioned, that is given the title Hadith al-Maqbul bil-i'tibar al-amal bihi aw adami. That this discussion is to discuss regarding hadith that one act upon and those that we do not act upon. So Ibn Hajar Rahimahullah Ta'ala, when he discussed this matter, he mentioned in his book Nukhbatul Fikr that he mentioned, that he then stated Thumma al-Maqbul, then al-Maqbul. So before we have discussed matter that relates to hadith by way of hadith al-Sahih, hadith al-Hasan, and what is mentioned regarding those discussion. Then he went on to mention also a hadith regarding ziyadat al-thiqat. So in cases where hadith is said to be the matan, or the hadith from what is apparent seems to be authentic, but there may be ziyadat, some form of additional wording in the text in the matan, or there's an addition mentioned by some of the narrators in the isnad. So he discussed concerning these ziyadat, what are the rulings that pertain to them. So we have discussed those matters regarding these ziyadat that may come in the form of, as they mentioned, ziyadat al-thiqa, and in the case of time is referred to as shadh when it is rejected. So those ziyadat, if it is something which is deemed to be rejected, then it is classed as shadh. It is graded as hadith shadh, or that portion of hadith is said to be shadh. What is accepted from it is considered to be mahfuz. So in the case of shadh, the opposite of it, which is the accepted part of hadith, the one that is said to be authentic, it will be considered to be mahfuz. Then he went on to discuss matters relating to hadith al-munkar wal-ma'ruf. So in case where hadith is said to be munkar, that there's some errors that have occurred in the hadith, al-khata, in the hadith, and this munkar, when it occurs in the hadith by way of the sanad or the matan, then also it is said to be munkar, and that is dismissed and said to be daif, and a very weak form of hadith daif. And also what is accepted is considered to be ma'ruf. Then after the author Rahimahullah Ta'ala Ibn Hajar, then he discussed that when you find in a case, when you find that is a single narrator, tafarrud, by one narrator, then what is the the procedures to be followed? So what's the line of procedures to be followed in case we find a single narrator in a section of the tabaqat of the isnad? What is the procedure to be followed? So the person tried to look regarding, or by way of the end, the asl of the isnad, which is sahabi. So the asl of the hadith is the sahabi. If you find it is a single sahaba, is there others that have narrated the hadith, similar to other sahaba that have narrated the hadith? So this process of trying to find, trying to research if there's other supporting hadith that coincide with hadith by way of the isnad or by way of the sahabi, then that is referred to as mutabat wa shawahid. So mutabat occurred regarding the isnad when you have tafarrud, and also shawahid when one seek to find are there other sahabi that have narrated that particular hadith, and we have given some example of those. Then also that process of the person doing that investigation, doing that research regarding finding mutabat wa shawahid, that is referred to as al-ittibar. So the act of ittibar, where that alim in hadith doing the research in trying to find other evidence or other supporting sources regarding the hadith that he's working with. Then the author then he moved on now to discuss another aspect regarding discussion regarding ilm al-hadith, where he mentioned thumma al-maqbul, then al-maqbul. إن سلم إن سلم إن سلم أو إن سلم من المعارض فهو محكم وإن عورض بمثله فإن أمكن الجم فمختلف الحديث. So that's not the next discussion that you will mention regarding of the point that relates to hadith. As you mentioned, ثم مقبول. Then regarding matters regarding al-maqbul, where the author he mentioned regarding concerning al-maqbul, and when we find cases where hadith that it is said to be muhkam, and also when hadith is class in the or the hadith is said to be placed in that area of mukhtaliful hadith. So that will be of our discussion regarding some of these points that he mentioned, and also he mentioned a third regarding a way to approach some of these hadith. Then as for this segment of what he mentioned, the sentence that in the talkhis he mentioned, فلما بين المصنف رحمه الله تعالى أوصاف أحاديث السالفة أو سابقة من جهة الأسانيد مقبولة ورد, that he mentioned that as for the muhallif who is Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, in this talkhis he mentioned that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, from what I proceeded, that he have outlined and clarified and have the discussion and explain in relation to hadith being said to be maqbul, and he mentioned al-maqbul, that either they class as al-maqbul, either sahih li or sahih li or hasan li or hasan li. So hadith al-maqbul, it falls into those four categories or those four areas. Hadith as-sahih li hadith that's said to be sahih on its own, hadith that is said to be sahih with other supporting sources, and hadith which is hasan لذاته ولغيره, and hadith which is said to be hasan by way of his on his own accord or with other supporting hadith. So those are said to be maqbul, and I mentioned wal rad, and also those hadith that are said to be dismissed, as we have mentioned some regarding ashadh and the like. Then I mentioned intaqala ila awsaf al-mutun al-maqbula. Then now the author Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala is to discuss matter regarding the mutun. So I've discussed regarding sahih by way of the isnad. Now he'll be discussing a hadith, or those hadith are said to be maqbul, acceptable, sahih, or hasan. Then I mentioned, as for those hadith are said to be maqbula, وَأَنَّ مِنْهَا مَا يُعْمَلْ بِهِ, amongst those hadith that are said to be maqbul, acceptable, amongst them there are those that we act upon, وَمِنْهَا, and amongst those مَا لَا يُعْمَلْ بِهِ, and of those that we do not act upon. Al-khabar al-maqbul qisman. Then I mentioned that as for those hadith are said to be maqbul, they are of two types. So as we stated, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that he mentioned regarding concerning that these hadith, that he mentioned here in brief that hadith they fall into two categories. Ma salima min ma'arada, those hadith that are said to be maqbul, but they are free from any form of that which contradicts it, or those hadith that those hadith that opposes it. So you find a hadith by way of the matan. So by way of the matan, the hadith is sahih, and we have mentioned before when hadith is graded as sahih and the conditions, and also hadith al-hasan and what are those conditions. So in those cases, the hadith is said to be maqbul. Then I mentioned salima min ma'arid, that the hadith also that we act upon is because those hadith that there's nothing that contradicts it or opposes it. So there's nothing that is contradicting that hadith or anything that is opposing that hadith. Then I mentioned that as for those hadith that there's nothing that is opposing it, I mentioned لم يأتي حديث آخر يعارضه في الظاهر. When there's no other hadith, there's no other hadith that is opposing, contradicting that hadith from what is apparent. Then I mentioned فيسمى هذا المحكم. Those type of hadith are said to be muhkam. So those hadith are said to be what are defined or given the definition according to the ulama of hadith as hadith al-muhkam. So that is said to be hadith al-muhkam. So those hadith are said to be muhkam, that are those hadith that there's nothing that contradicts it from another hadith. So in this discussion they mention regarding concerning this matter of hadith al-muhkam, where from what is mentioned by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that we have hadith that are said to be maqbul, that they fall into two categories. of those in which we act upon and those in which we do not act upon. So hadith may be maqbool, authentic by way of isnad. As for the next matter regarding these hadith that are said to be maqbool, acceptable, those that we act upon and they are very clear as for the meaning and what is taken from it. Then we have another set of hadith that, and also you find nothing that goes in contrary to it or oppose it. Then also we have another set of hadith, a second set of hadith that you might find that it may contradict another hadith that is authentic, that is said to be maqbool. So as for the first regarding hadith that he mentioned, so the first regarding hadith al-muhkam, they mentioned regarding al-muhkam that mean concerning istilahan, or lugatan, it mean atqana. So muhkam meaning something is ahkam, that the person has the person very precise, on point about a matter. So being on point, being very precise on a matter is said to be itqan. So being precise, and that is said to be the meaning of muhkam linguistically. As for hadith al-muhkam, in amongst the ulama of hadith that they mentioned, as for this category of hadith that they mentioned, that muhkam hadith istilahan al-maqbool alladhi salima min mu'arad, that a hadith that there's nothing that opposes it. So hadith that is free from anything that opposes it. Meaning that we have hadith, a group of hadith, but none of them are opposing each other. Or we have a hadith and there's no other hadith that is opposing it. And the meaning, and they're discussing the same thing, but they're two hadith with two different chains. So separate hadith discussing maybe the same matter and they're not opposing each other. So the hadith is free from any form of opposition. So mu'arad that I mentioned, la yudad, that's something that nothing that's not yudadu, nothing that opposes it, contradicts it, nothing that they mention tunaqidu, nothing that contradicts it. So there's nothing that nullifies that hadith. So there's nothing that somewhat opposes that hadith but may nullify that hadith. So they mentioned regarding concerning that matter is said to be hadith that is given, referred to as such called hadith al-muhkam, where people act upon it without anything to contradict it. People accept it without anything that goes against it. That's said to be hadith muhkam. So hadith al-maqbool alladhi salima min ma'arad. So they mentioned that that's hadith al-muhkam. And they mentioned that those things that it is free from mu'arada, nothing that contradicts it, opposes it, and also nothing that concerns salamtu min al-nasakh, and also it is free from anything that may abrogate it. So hadith which is muhkam, there's nothing that affects it or contradicts it by way of other hadith opposing it. And second, there's no other hadith that also may nullify, that may abrogate that hadith. There's nothing that also that abrogates that hadith. Then I mentioned Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, when he mentioned this hadith, that he mentioned that these hadith, they form the bulk of the hadith. They form the bulk of hadith regarding hadith that you find that there is nothing that contradicts that particular hadith. Then then the author went on to mention, then he started to give some examples regarding this matter. So overall, they mentioned that hadith salima min al-ma'arada, that nothing contradicted, then that hadith is referred to as hadith al-muhkam. Hadith al-muhkam meaning that these are the hadith that people act upon, and because there is nothing that contradicts it. And they mentioned that that's the bulk of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So the majority and the bulk of the hadith that have reached us about the Prophet ﷺ, they fall into this category. They fall into this category. Regarding, then I mentioned regarding concern to that, examples of hadith that may fall into that category. So they mention different hadith, but you never find a hadith that will contradict this. They mention of those hadith, the hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. They don't have anything that contradicts that hadith. If you don't have another hadith that have come to us that contradicts the hadith. So the hadith is very straightforward about what can be taken and understood from hadith, and also nothing that goes against it. And also they mention adinu nasiha. So also here they mentioned of those hadith that said to be hadith al-muhkam, adinu nasiha. And also the Prophet ﷺ mentioned hadith, kullu bid'ah dalala. kullu bid'ah dalala, that every bid'ah is a misguidance. By way of there's no hadith that contradicts this. And we're not saying this, so that's concerning any hadith that contradicts these matters. And we're not including here aqwal al-nas. So as for the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that there's nothing that he has said that may contradict this particular, these matters. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala that have mentioned other hadith, they have mentioned other hadith where of the thing that he mentioned that when he mentioned some of these hadith, they mentioned that Al-Hakim mentioned regarding that when he mentioned these, they mentioned Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi that in his book Marifat Ulum al-Hadith, when he mentioned it, says هذه هي السنة صحيحة لا معارضة لها. That sometimes mentions some hadith said that there's nothing that contradicts these hadith, showing that these hadith they are muhkam, where there's nothing that contradicts these hadith. Of the point also the ulama have mentioned, of those who have written the field of hadith, that they have this category of hadith, hadith al-muhkam, that they have stated that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned this category within within Mustalah al-Hadith, Ulum al-Hadith, but you find that is something that he took from Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi. As for Ibn Salah in his book Muqaddimah or Muqaddimah Muqaddimah Ibn Salah, that he did not mention this category of hadith. So Ibn Salah did not mention this category of hadith being what is referred to as hadith al-muhkam. This was not mentioned by Ibn Salah and those who make the muhtasarat of his book. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that of those who included this, amongst those who came after who included this within what is discussed within the science of mustalah as being of one of the categories of hadith to be mentioned. So he mentioned this. So he mentions Ibn Salah did not made mention of this in his book Muqaddimah Ibn Salah. So even Manawi, he mentioned that in his explanation column, "I'lam anna hadha zadahu al-mu'allif." When he explained the book of Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, Manawi, he mentioned that "I'lam," for you to know, anna hadha zadahu al-mu'allif, meaning that is something that was included or something was added by Ibn Hajar, not mentioned by Ibn Salah. Mentioned في أنواع على متأخرين آخر من كلام الحاكم, where he mentioned that most of the ulama of his time or before him, that after Ibn Salah, from Ibn Salah onwards up until his time, never included this, never mention of this type of hadith, except for they mentioned that we took this from آخذا من كلام الحاكم, taking this from what is stated by Al-Hakim. So Al-Hakim mentioned this or alluded to this, so he took it from this, from Hakim, and he acted upon this. So you find that Al-Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala, that in his book here, that is referred to as Marifatu Ulum al-Hadith wa Kammiyat Ajnasi, when he mentioned in his book here that Al-Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala, that he died 405 al-Hijri, that of those chapters that he mentioned within his book, he referred to as a chapter as Dhikri an-Naw at-Tasi' wal-Ishreen, that meaning the 29th type of hadith, min ulum al-hadith, of this type, which is the 29th category of ulum al-hadith. He mentioned قال هذا نوع من هذه علوم معرفة سنن لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم مثلها فليحتج أصحاب المذاهب بأحدهما. Then he mentioned, which he referred to, and he started to give the example of what he kind of somewhat mentioned, that this category regarding, he gave examples. So he didn't mention the name by saying that this is hadith that's called muhkam, but then by his example he gave some of these example that or mukhtalif al-hadith, regarding mukhtalif al-hadith. So he discussed concerning these hadith and mentioned these type of hadith regarding, as we'll discuss, mukhtalif al-hadith. So generally concerned the ulama that they included this, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned this within his book. So they mentioned regarding concerning that with this particular hadith that I mentioned that it is stated by Al-Hakim that regarding of those who may have written on this topic regarding a hadith al-muhkam, that they mentioned that of those that Uthman ibn Sa'id ad-Darimi rahimahullah ta'ala, that he wrote a book on this topic. So it is stated ذكر الحاكم أن عثمان ibn Sa'id ad-Darimi صنف فيه كتابا كبيرا, that it is mentioned that this has been written upon, or this topic that they have written on this particular topic. So overall, we're going to consider that. So also you might find that a hadith that, as we mentioned, that ulama in acting upon a hadith, what he mentioned here regarding hadith al-maqbul, thumma maqbul, as mentioned by Ibn Hajar, that hadith al-maqbul, that we act upon them, and that's the bulk of the hadith. But then also to bear in mind regarding concern, so that you find that for one, two of the condition of acting upon a hadith is ensuring the hadith is maqbul. So of those of the criteria of those shurut condition of acting upon a hadith, then a person should try to ensure the hadith that they're acting upon, that's a hadith which is maqbul. Hadith is said to be of the category of either sahih or hasan. But then Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, that so he mentioned that, but also you might find hadith which is sahih but not acted upon. You might find hadith which is sahih that is not acted upon. They mentioned after then regarding concerning this matter that maqbul is what is acted upon. Then he mentioned in kana. Then he mentioned that. So also you find that hadith that sometimes is authentic, but it is not acted upon. As in this talkhis, he went on to mention regarding concerning that regarding that on this matter, that you might find hadith lam yusallim min al-mu'arad, that hadith that he may not be free from any form of that which goes against it, that oppose it. Urid bimithli, that the hadith urid bimithli, that it may be contradicted by something similar in sense, similar by way of another hadith which is authentic, hadith which is maqbul, that it is contradicting, going against a hadith which is maqbul. So find one hadith is maqbul, then we'll find another hadith that's also maqbul, or a set of hadith that is also maqbul between themselves, that you'll find that some saying one thing and the other saying something. They seem to be contradicting or going against each other. So they mentioned that that this at time may occur, as they mention a hadith yaqa بينها تعارض في الظاهر, with these hadith that what seems apparent they may be contradicting or going against each other. They mentioned that he mentioned that فإن أورد الحديث المقبول بحديث مثلي, that if hadith is said to be maqbul, that goes against hadith which is said to be similar to it, قال المقبول هذا لا يخلو من حالين. So you find a hadith which is maqbul, another hadith which is maqbul but seem to be contradicting each other, then it either fall into two categories. You mentioned يمكن الجم and لا يمكن الجم. So you mentioned that either one, a possibility that the hadith that they can be combined together or harmonize, al-jam in the sense of harmonize between themselves, وإن أمكن الجم بينهما. So if that is possible, then that should be the route that should be taken, so as to act upon all the hadith, i'mal kull hadith, with a person able to act upon all the hadith. Then I mentioned, if that's the case, where one is able to act upon all those hadith, even though seen from what is apparent to be contradicting, call it referred to as yusamma mukhtaliful hadith. It is referred to as mukhtaliful hadith. It is said to refer to as mukhtaliful hadith, hadith that seems to contradict each other. It is referred to as mukhtaliful hadith. So he mentioned here, and that is what goes against. So that's concerning where you find that the hadith that seems to be the hadith is said to be muhkam because there's nothing that goes against it. But you might find cases where the hadith, other hadith may be going against it. So what to be done in that case and to be discussed. So overall I mentioned these two types of hadith, which is said to be the first, hadith al-muhkam, and those hadith which is mukhtalif al-hadith. Mukhtalif al-hadith, that it seems to be opposing another hadith by way of the matan. So it's not by way of the isnad, but this is by way of the text of the hadith that seem to be contradicting another hadith. So you might find at times this may occur. You might find at times this may occur. And we find that hadith that they are both authentic. Just also to bear in mind that also you might find that hadith, he mentioned that hadith that is said to be muhkam, that we mentioned two things. The ulama mentioned two things. One, the hadith salim min mu'arid, there's nothing that opposes it, and also, and that the thing that, and the second things that also it is free from salamtu min al-nask, that also there's nothing that abrogates it. Another area, another matter to take into account that you find that At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, so Imam At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, in his book Ilal al-Saghir, as referred to, and this Ilal al-Saghir that is at the end of his Jami', so his book Al-Jami', or referred to as Sunan At-Tirmidhi, that at the end of this book he wrote a small thesis regarding matters pertaining to Ilm al-Hadith. Of what he mentioned and included in this discussion, he started by saying, with this, where it is mentioned, Jamia ma fi hadha kitab, everything or all that is mentioned in this book, all that is mentioned inside of this book Al-Jami' min hadith, from the hadith, fahuwa ma'amulun bihi, it is acted upon. All the hadith that I have mentioned in this book, it is acted upon. وَبِهِ أَخَذَ بَعْضَ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ, and these hadith are taken, acted upon by some of the ulama. فَمَا خَلَى حَدِيثَيْن, with the exception of two hadith. So what he's saying, before we continue, that At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned that all the hadith in this book that he have mentioned, that the ulama, there is hadith that are acted upon by some of the ulama. So even though not all the hadith in this book is considered to be authentic, maqbool, there's hadith in this collection that said to be da'if, but overall is highlighting to us that even with this being the case, that you'll find that some of the ulama have acted upon some of those hadith and have taken draw rulings from these hadith, even though not everything in this book is authentic. So in showing that may of the ulama who at times may take a hadith, act upon a hadith, but a hadith is said to be da'if. But overall, then he mentioned that the ulama have taken these hadith and acted upon them except for two hadith. So they mentioned that ulama at times, I mentioned that hadith that may fall into this category, laysa li amal. Hadith may be said to be authentic, but it is not acted upon. Laysa li amal. So he can somewhat mention that with the case being all the hadith that I mentioned in this book, acted upon by the ulama, khala hadithan, except with two hadith. Then he mentioned those hadith of Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, and Nabi Islam قال جمع بين الظهر والعصر بالمدينة والمغرب والعشاء من غير خوف ولا سفر. Also mentioned sakam, that so he mentioned that the hadith, they mentioned that al-ulama, all the hadith are acted upon except for two hadith, according to what is mentioned here by At-Tirmidhi. He mentioned all the hadith in this book acted upon except for these two. He mentioned the hadith of Ibn Abbas, that regarding that the Prophet ﷺ combined between Dhuhr and Asr in Medina and Maghrib and Isha, not in a time of traveling or khawf or fear. Also narration mentioned sakam or illness. Then I mentioned hadith as hadith, and then I mentioned the hadith upon the Prophet ﷺ أنه قال عليه السلام إذا شرب الخمر فاجلدوا, if one drink khamar, he should be whipped. فإن عاد, and if he returns في الرابعة, and if he returns, repeat the act over again and reach the fourth time, فاقتلوا, then he should be killed. Then he mentioned that he discussed this hadith by way of why some of the ulama did not act upon these two hadith. So at times the hadith may be said to be authentic, but laysa li amal, but the ulama did not act in according to it. So that's to show that that's one to be mindful of, known concerning of those cases when they occur. When cases like of those, that does occur. As for the matter regarding the ulama acting upon hadith with da'if, then that to be discussed at the appropriate time. That to be discussed regarding acting upon hadith which is said to be da'if in fada'il al-amal or other cases. That to be discussed later. So back to our topic that is being mentioned, where the author rahimahullah ta'ala that discussing regarding a hadith that are said to be of the next category, said to be mukhtaliful hadith. So now we're discussing what is now discussed as mukhtaliful hadith. So this mukhtaliful hadith that mentioned here by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala that they have explained mukhtalif meaning opposite of ittifaq. So mukhtalif opposite of ittifaq. So mean that everything is not combined together, they are separate. He mentioned here what is defined as mukhtaliful hadith, hadithan or ahadith or hadithan مقبولان متعارضان في معنى ظاهر مطلقة وأمكن الجمع بينهما. So what is said to be مختلف الحديث, that is these categories of hadith are said to be hadithan or hadith, أحاديث المقبولة, that seem to be متعارضة, that seem to be contradicting each other from what is apparent, from what it seems, from its meaning. وأمكن الجمع, but there's ways of how to harmonize between those hadiths, how to consolidate between those hadith. So that's referred to as these hadith are said are classed, are referred to as mukhtaliful hadith. So these hadith are hadith that seems to be opposing each other, but if approached properly, they can be joined together and give a meaning or a hukum. So that's concerning what is said to be that fall into that category, that's said to fall into this category regarding hadith, mukhtalif al-hadith, mukhtalif al-hadith. So they have mentioned regarding concern, so what is so regarding this matter, so these hadith al-mukhtalif al-hadith, it doesn't, that would mean the hadith are said to be maqbool. The ulama use the word maqbool, not sahih, as you might find in the case where hadith may be sahih, or hadith is said to be hasan, and hadith is said to be sahih, that seem to be contradicting each other. Or hadith is sahih, and hadith is sahih, but the main thing that all the hadith are said to be maqbool. They are within what is said to be hadith maqbool, acceptable, authentic, whether of the highest grading or the grading which is below, which is hasan. If there's hadith seem to be contradicting each other, how to harmonize those hadith, how to rectify, come out with a one result with those hadith. If one is able to do so, then that is called, that type of jam is referred to as mukhtalif al-hadith. So even though they seem to be contradicting each other, but they are able to can harmonize between those hadith. So the hadith don't have to be same in authenticity, the fact that they are authentic, within the reach of authenticity, sahih or hasan. And this is where you find that, as we mentioned before, that Al-Hakim kind of somewhat gave some examples. So Hakim, well, mentioned that now we mentioned a point regarding Tasil Ishrin, or Tasil Ishrin, that min ulum al-hadith, he discussed this particular point. He discussed this particular point regarding mukhtalif al-hadith. So referred to as mukhtalif al-hadith, that he discussed this point. So he'll mention regarding some examples. So he gave examples. So he gave examples where hadith that seems what is apparent, how it seems by some that the hadith seem to be contradicting. So he mentioned regarding concerning that, and he gave some examples. He gave some examples. The ulama, they mentioned regarding this mukhtalif al-hadith of the criteria. One, all the hadith involved are said to be sahih or maqbool. So the hadith, all the hadith that are involved are said to be hadith that have been graded maqbool. Some of those hadith seems to contradict others. One saying something on the same matter, but they're giving two different conclusions. But all are authentic. So how to harmonize in such case? So example of what we are speaking of, that of those example, that we go to the book of Sunan Ibn Majah. We go to the book of Sunan Ibn Majah. The Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, or hadith that I mentioned here by Ibn Majah in the Sunan, قال باب القراءة خلف الإمام. باب القراءة خلف الإمام, reciting behind the imam, يعني in the salah. So the imam in the salah, reciting behind the imam. The dimension is isnad. So by way of just al-isnad mention, قال يعني بسندي قال حدثنا هشام ابن عمار وسهل ابن أبي سهل وإسحاق ابن إسماعيل قالوا, all of whom I've mentioned, حدثنا سفيان ابن عيينة عن زهري عن محمود ابن ربيع عن عبادة ابن صامت رضي عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لا صلاة لمن لم يقرأ فيها بفاتحة الكتاب. So in this hadith, that the author here mentioned that the hadith of Ubadah ibn Samit with the isnad, that the Prophet ﷺ have said in the hadith, La salat, there's no salat for a one who did not recite Fatiha behind the Imam. La salat liman lam yakra fiha, or there's no salat for the one who did not read the opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Fatiha. Then he mentioned several hadith with this particular meaning. Then also he mentioned the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, قال قال رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام من صلى صلاة لم يقرأ فيها القرآن فهو خداج غير تام. So also the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the next hadith, they mentioned that the one who did not read Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, then his salat is khidaj, and he mentioned khidaj غير تام, it is not complete. So he mentioned hadith of that nature. He mentioned hadith of that nature. Then he mentioned, after this, he said the hadith, Surah Hadith, showing that the person should read Fatiha in his salah. And if his salat is not, if without Fatiha, the salat is not complete. Then he mentioned the next in that matter, and Abi Hurairah, or he mentioned the isnad, where he stated, قال حدثنا أبو بكر بن أبي شيبة قال حدثنا أبو خالد أحمر عن ابن أجلان عن زيد بن أسلم عن أبي صالح عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام إنما جعل الإمام ليتم به. That the Prophet ﷺ mentioned hadith of Abu Hurairah, and that we mentioned here, that indeed he has placed the Imam to be followed. فَإِذَا كَبَّرْ فَكَبَّرُوا. If the Imam give the takbir, you should also do the same. Then he mentioned فَإِذَا قَرَأَ, and if the Imam recites فَأَنْصِتُوا, then you should remain silent. Al-Hadith. So in this hadith, the shahid from the hadith, that the first of the hadith mentioned one reading Al-Fatiha in the Salat, and in this case it mentioned that if the Imam read, you should follow the Imam, and mention فَإِذَا قَرَأَ فَأَنْصِتُوا. When the Imam reading, you should remain silent. When the Imam reads, you should remain silent. So of the ulama discussed concerning the matter regarding how to harmonize between a hadith of that nature. How to harmonize between. So is the way the person able to can harmonize those hadith and come out with one conclusion, then this hadith fall into mukhtalif al-hadith. Fall into mukhtalif al-hadith. So overall, you find that this is of those areas that are discussed amongst the ulama regarding this particular discussion regarding hadith of this nature that one have to be mindful of. So we have mukhtalif al-hadith, and we mentioned that if one is able to can harmonize, combine between those hadith and come out with one final conclusion by working with all those hadith, then that's said to be, even it seems to be opposing, but in reality that's not the case, then that is classed as mukhtalif al-hadith. As for this, that you find that of the ulama who have written on this topic, amongst those who have written on this topic, of the more of the works on this topic, we have the book of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, of the early ones who have written on this topic. We refer to his book as Mukhtalif al-Hadith. Also, of those, Ibn Qutaybah, who have written also on this topic regarding Mukhtalif al-Hadith, and also Tahawi, Abu Jafar Tahawi, who have written, they mentioned, 2 books around this topic. So I've written 2 books on this topic, Shar Ma'ani al-Athar wa Shar Mushkil al-Athar. So Al-Tahawi rahimahullah ta'ala, Al-Hanafi, that have works on this, and his works are more detailed, but he have several works on this 2 large books that he discussed this particular. They mention Shar Ma'ani al-Athar and also Shar Mushkil al-Athar. So those books are in print, and in the next we'll discuss something around those books regarding of those who have written on this topic and the topic Mukhtalif al-Hadith. So this is so that's concerned the author rahimahullah ta'ala want to bring our attention regarding that. There may be cases where hadith, in the field of hadith, so show the ulama of hadith that also they paid attention to the mutun, contrary to what sometimes some try to give the impression or misinform others, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that the ulama of hadith didn't critique the matan. All the emphasis was on the isnad, which is contrary to the reality. That the ulama of hadith, that they give attention to the mutun, to the text of the hadith, where they have this within the sense of hadith, what is discussed regarding mukhtalif al-hadith and hadith al-muhkam. So to ensure that the hadith that we are working with, that if there's any form of contradiction or what it seems to be contradiction, how we should approach the hadith, and also other matter that relates to the mutun, the text of hadith, also to be discussed in the coming sessions. So this is the proof again that the ulama of hadith did, and still up until today, give attention to the hadith by way of the sanad, and also by way of the matan. By way of the sanad, and also by way of the matan. So they mentioned that Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala have written on this topic. So of those books, Ikhtilaf al-Hadith by Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. Also you'll find that Ta'wil Mukhtalif al-Hadith by Ibn Qutaybah, who is Abdullah ibn Muslim ibn Qutaybah, Abu Muhammad, who died the year 276, who died 276, and his book is in print. Also Shar Mushkil Athar by At-Tahawi, and as we mentioned that his book is more of the one that goes more in detail. So his book that come in many volumes, and in the next session we can somewhat highlight those books of and also you'll find other books of hadith that may, and also find that other books that may contain of this topic. That one also should look at the hadith and the matan, to also go to certain books that are said to be Shuruhat al-Hadithiyah, books that explain hadith, that they would also mention of some of these points regarding Mukhtalif al-Hadith. So of those works that would also give us some insight into those matters, the book of Fath al-Bari, the Ibn Rajab al-Asqalani, and before him the book of Tamheed by Ibn Abdul Barr, the book of Al-Istizkar by him also, and also so those books of hadith that they would also point out some of these points regarding Mukhtalif al-Hadith. And we say Muhkam al-Hadith, that most books of what we call Kutub al-Hadith, that is what that you will find this in most of the books of Hadith, where it says Kutub al-Hadith al-Ahkam. So Kutub al-Hadith al-Ahkam, that they will cover this topic by clarifying those Hadith are said to be Muhkam, and also they will mention at times Hadith are said to be Mukhtalif al-Hadith, and also, as we discuss, other Hadith that fi ta'arud. So the ulama of Hadith have somewhat given this a lot of attention, and we said that in coming we'll discuss some of those works around this topic, and also even works of contemporaries regarding verifying of the mutun of the Hadith, the mutun, the text of Hadith, contrary to of the misinformation or misunderstanding by some, or ignorance of some regarding the efforts of the ulama of Hadith of past and of present, regarding giving due attention to the matan, to the text of the body, the text of the Hadith. So that inshallah ta'ala will end for today, and continue in the next session regarding continuing this discussion and other that is mentioned by the author rahimahullah ta'ala in this book Talkhis Nukhbatul Fikr. With this inshallah ta'ala will end today's session. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهادي إلى السبيل والآخرة والحمد لله.